Rain hammered against the gravestone as Russell Vance fell to his knees, clutching a wilted bouquet against the cold marble. His voice cracked as he whispered his daughter's name, begging for forgiveness from someone he thought he'd lost forever. Behind a cluster of cedar trees, a woman stood trembling, tears cutting through the rain on her face. She was alive. Watching him break. Watching him mourn the death that never happened. And for the first time in years, she wished she'd stayed dead. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. Sandpoint, Idaho wasn't built for billionaires. It was a town for fishermen, farmers, and folks who measured wealth by what they could fix with their own hands. But Russell Vance didn't belong to that kind of simplicity anymore. Once upon a time, he had been one of them, a mechanic's son who built an empire from nothing but a knack for solving problems and a hunger that wouldn't quit. Now, the man who could buy half the state couldn't fix the only thing that mattered. His daughter was gone. The mansion sat on a hill above Lake Pend-Oreille, glass walls reflecting the storm clouds that gathered each afternoon. Inside, the air felt thick, like the house itself held its breath. Every photo frame was the same, Russell's smile beside a young woman with sunlit hair and eyes that mirrored his own, Adeline. 3 years had passed since that crash. 3 years since the police knocked on his door and told him they found her car at the bottom of a ravine, engulfed in flames. The body they pulled out couldn't be recognized, but the ring on the charred hand, one he'd given her for her 21st birthday, was enough to close the case. Russell never believed it. Not entirely. He spent months chasing answers. Private investigators, police reports, satellite photos. But eventually, even the most relentless grief exhausts itself. The people around him urged him to move on. She's gone, Russell. You need to accept that. He never did. Each morning, before sunrise, he drove the winding road down to Greenwood Cemetery. The caretaker didn't bother asking questions anymore. Russell came with fresh flowers every Thursday, always the same ones, Adeline's favorite, white chrysanthemums. He'd sit by her headstone for hours, speaking to the silence, waiting for something, anything, to speak back. That morning had been no different, until something small caught his eye. A single tulip. Not his. Freshly placed. Russell frowned. He hadn't brought tulips in years, not since Adeline was a child, when she'd plant them around their old house with her mother every spring. He turned the bloom in his hand, water dripping from its stem, a faint trace of perfume clinging to it. Someone had been there before him. He told himself it was the caretaker, maybe a kind neighbor. But as he looked at the tulip again, something inside him shifted, a quiet suspicion that this wasn't random. He drove home slower than usual that day. The drive up the hill used to feel triumphant, back when success was all he could see. Now, every turn of the tires sounded like judgment. The gate opened automatically, revealing a house that looked more like a museum than a home. Organized. Russell walked straight to his study. On the wall above the fireplace hung a painting of Lake Pend-Oreille at sunrise. Adeline had painted it years ago, when she was 15, her first art show in town. He'd missed it for a business trip. He told her he'd catch the next one. There hadn't been a next one. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at his desk, staring at an unopened letter, her last one. The postmark was dated a week before her accident. He couldn't bring himself to read it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and for a brief second, he thought he heard her laughter. It was faint, carried by memory, but it was enough to break him. The strongest man in Idaho leaned forward, pressing his forehead to his hands, shaking with a sound that didn't quite reach a sob. He wasn't crying for the daughter he lost. He was crying for the father he never got to be. Years of meetings, late nights, empty promises, they all came back in one crushing wave. He built an empire to make her proud, but all it did was drive her away. Sometimes, guilt doesn't come from what we do wrong. It comes from what we don't do at all. If you've ever told yourself you'd call someone tomorrow, say sorry next week, or make time when things settle down, remember this. Someday, there won't be a tomorrow to fix what's broken. Maybe today is that day. Subscribe if you believe that love, once gone, deserves a second chance, even if it's only through stories like this. That night, Russell sat by his window long after the storm had passed. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the lake below. In the distance, down by the cemetery road, a pair of headlights appeared, paused, then disappeared into the fog. He didn't think much of it, just another passerby. But at the gravesite, a woman stood in the rain, hood pulled over her face, staring down at the tulip she'd placed earlier. Her hands trembled as she whispered something only the dead could hear. "I'm sorry, Dad." Then she turned, walking away before the dawn light could reveal her face. Russell would wake early the next morning and find another tulip waiting by the grave, proof that grief doesn't always mean goodbye. And for the first time in years, he'd feel something flicker inside him again. Not hope, not peace, just the faint, dangerous whisper of a question he wasn't ready to ask. What if she's still out there? The diner was always warm, even on the coldest mornings. Steam fogged the windows, the smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and the kind of country music that no one really listens to anymore hummed through a crackling speaker in the corner. That was how Lena Caro liked it. No questions, no noise from the past, no reminders of the name she used to have. She'd been working at Red Fern Diner for nearly 2 years. It sat off the highway near Coeur d'Alene, far enough from Sandpoint that nobody recognized her face, but close enough that she could still feel the chill from the lake she grew up near. Lena wasn't supposed to exist. Not legally, not publicly, not at all. But fake names and quiet towns were good for people who wanted to disappear. The regulars just knew her as the woman who showed up early, stayed late, and never said much. She smiled when customers were kind, ignored them when they weren't, and kept her head down. Every night, after closing, she'd walk home along a stretch of back road lit by a single flickering street lamp. Her apartment was a converted attic above an old hardware store, a place that smelled faintly of cedar and oil. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Safe, that is, until one morning when she unfolded the local paper and saw a headline that made her stomach twist. Russell Vance donates $10 million to search and rescue program in daughter's memory. The article had a photo. He looked older. Gray in his beard, eyes sunk deep like the years had finally caught up to him. Lena's hands trembled as she touched the image, tracing the outline of his face with a quiet, broken breath. She hadn't seen her father since the night everything went wrong, since the explosion that everyone believed killed her. That night had been the end of one life and the beginning of another. She remembered it vividly. The argument. The voicemail she left him that he never returned. The headlights that followed her car for miles through the fog. The sound of the impact. The metal tearing, the flames. Then waking up in a stranger's cabin miles away, with no explanation except survival and fear. When she saw the news that her body had been found, something inside her snapped. She didn't go to the police. She didn't call her father. She vanished. In the months that followed, she found out why someone had wanted her dead. She'd uncovered something, a folder left on her father's office desk, documents that pointed to illegal deals inside his company. At the time, she thought it was him. That he was the villain. That her death would protect his empire. But now, looking at that newspaper photo, she wasn't sure anymore. Russell didn't look powerful. He looked empty. That afternoon, as the diner quieted and the last customers left, Lena leaned against the counter and stared out at the falling snow. She wondered if he still visited her grave. She wondered if he blamed himself. She wondered if he ever suspected the truth. Then came the voice that broke her trance. "Hey, Lena, you okay?" It was Joyce, the diner's owner, a tough woman in her 60s with a heart of gold and a cigarette voice that could cut through glass. She cared for Lena in the way small-town folks care for their own, without prying, but always noticing. "Yeah," Lena said softly, folding her apron. "Just tired." Joyce nodded. "You need a ride home? Snow's coming down hard." "A walk? It clears my head." Joyce shrugged, dropping a few bills in Lena's hand. "Suit yourself, sweetheart. Be careful." Lena slipped on her jacket and stepped into the night. The snow came down in thick, heavy flakes, muffling everything around her. The world felt small, still, and for once, peaceful. But halfway down the road, she felt something, a shadow moving where it shouldn't. She turned. Nothing. Still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She pulled her hood tighter and walked faster. At home, she double-checked the locks, pulled the curtains shut, and leaned against the door, her heart pounding harder than she wanted to admit. It was just nerves, she told herself. Just the ghosts that never quite stopped following her. But when she glanced out the window, her blood ran cold. Across the street, under the streetlight, a black sedan sat idling. Headlights off. No movement. Just silence. She waited. 5 minutes. Still there. Lena reached for her phone, then froze. She couldn't call the police, not without risking exposure. If her name got checked, if her prints got run, the truth would come out. She'd be dragged back into a world she wasn't ready to face. So she did what she always did. She hid. She turned off the lights, pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders, and sat in the dark until exhaustion finally took her. The next morning, the car was gone. But taped to her door was an envelope. No return address. Just one line written in ink across the front. Adeline Vance, confirmed alive. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped it. Inside, there was a single photograph, a grainy image of her walking home from the diner, dated 2 nights ago. And beneath it, a business card. Warren Kelder, Vance Holdings. She knew that name. Her father's oldest business partner. The same man who handled her trust fund before the crash. She sat on the edge of her bed, heart racing. The world she had run from was catching up to her, and the one person she'd tried hardest to forget was somehow tangled in all of it. She looked back at the newspaper still lying on her counter, her father's face staring up at her from the front page. For the first time in years, she whispered his name out loud. Dad. The word came out like a confession, breaking something open inside her. If Warren was looking for her, it meant only one thing. He discovered she was alive. And if he knew, then soon, so would her father. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the roads, the rooftops, and the footprints she'd left behind. But some things can't stay buried forever. That night, as she stared out the window again, she saw the black sedan return. This time, someone stepped out, a tall figure in a dark coat, holding the same envelope she'd just opened. He looked up toward her window. And when their eyes met, Lena's breath caught. It wasn't Warren. It was her father's head of security. The snow in Sandpoint didn't melt that week. It gathered on rooftops, pressed against windows, and turned the lake into a mirror of gray stillness. For Russell Vance, it felt like the world had stopped just long enough for him to hear the things he'd been ignoring, his own thoughts. He'd spent the past few nights in his study, surrounded by papers, old reports, and photographs of his daughter. He told himself it was about closure, about letting go. But somewhere deep down, he knew it wasn't. The tulip that had appeared at Adeline's grave wasn't random. And the more he thought about it, the more it clawed at his peace of mind. He pulled out the old police file for what felt like the 100th time. Burn marks, tire tracks, witness statements, all of it neat, tidy, perfectly explained. Too perfect. Russell had lived long enough to know that life rarely wrapped itself up that cleanly. That's when he noticed something strange, something he should have seen years ago. The report listed a responding officer, Deputy Howard Franks, as the first on the scene. But Franks wasn't local. He'd been transferred from Coeur d'Alene just 2 weeks before the crash, and quit the force 3 days after filing the report. No record of where he went next. Russell sat back, heart pounding. Coincidence? Maybe. But it felt like a loose thread, and he'd spent his life pulling threads until the truth unraveled. He called an old contact from his private security team, a man he trusted more than anyone, Daniel Shore. Find out everything you can about Howard Franks, he said quietly, and check if Warren Kelder had any contact with him back then. Daniel hesitated. You think Warren was involved? Russell didn't answer. He just stared at the photo of Adeline pinned to the wall and whispered, I think I've been blind for too long. Meanwhile, 100 miles away, Lena Caro, the woman the world believed was dead, was packing a bag she hadn't touched in years. Her hands trembled as she shoved a few clothes into it, glancing at the window every few seconds. The black sedan hadn't returned since the night before, but she knew better than to feel safe. She still had the envelope. The photograph. The card with Warren Kelder's name. Part of her wanted to run, leave Idaho again, vanish into another small town with a new name and a new lie. But she was tired of running. Tired of watching from the shadows while her father suffered for sins he didn't commit. She thought back to the night of the crash, the headlights that came out of nowhere, the truck that forced her off the road. The sound of the tires, the flash of fire, the silence that followed. For years she told herself it was her father's doing. It was easier that way. Easier to hate him than to admit she might have been wrong. But now, with Warren's name back in the picture, doubt had found a way in. She didn't know who to trust, but she knew she couldn't hide anymore. Russell's investigation moved fast. Within days, Daniel returned with information that shattered what little peace Russell had left. Howard Franks had been paid through a shell company, a company connected to none other than Warren Kelder, his oldest friend and former business partner. It didn't end there. Bank statements showed transactions that matched dates surrounding Adeline's crash. Someone had bought silence. Someone had covered tracks. Russell's chest tightened as he scrolled through the files. Every line was another betrayal. He stormed into his garage, yanked open the storage cabinet, and pulled out a box labeled Adeline, Personal. Inside were photos, art sketches, small notes she'd written as a child. Underneath them lay a flash drive he hadn't noticed before. He plugged it into his computer, heart pounding. The screen flickered, then loaded a folder labeled, If Something Happens to Me. Inside was a video file. He hesitated, then clicked play. Adeline appeared on screen, sitting in his old office, her face pale but determined. "Dad," she began, voice shaky. "I found something in Warren's accounts. I don't know what it means, but it's bad. I'm scared. If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident. Please, just believe me." The video ended there. No timestamp, no follow-up. Just those words, looping in Russell's mind until he could barely breathe. He hadn't lost her because of fate. He'd lost her because he trusted the wrong man. That night, Lena found herself walking along the edge of the frozen lake outside Coeur d'Alene, where the reflection of the moon danced across the surface. She hadn't been back here since she was a teenager. It was the place her father used to bring her when business didn't get in the way, the rare nights they actually talked. She missed that version of him. The man who laughed easily. The man who taught her how to skip stones. The man she once believed could fix anything. Now, she wasn't sure who he really was anymore, but she knew one thing. If she didn't face him soon, someone else would. The thought terrified her. She imagined what she'd say if they ever met again. Would he even recognize her? Would he hate her for letting him grieve all these years? She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling the weight of every choice she'd made. Some wounds never heal because we never let them. We wait for time to make things right, for anger to fade, for courage to come. But life doesn't wait. If there's someone you've pushed away, someone who needs to hear your truth, don't wait for the perfect moment. It may never come. Subscribe if you believe some stories exist to remind us how fragile forgiveness really is. By morning, Lena made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding. She packed her few belongings, burned the fake IDs she'd used to survive, and bought a one-way bus ticket to Sandpoint. As the bus rolled through the snowy hills, she watched the world she'd avoided for so long come back into view. Familiar roads, familiar trees, familiar pain. Meanwhile, back in Sandpoint, Russell was standing in his office, holding the flash drive in one hand and an old photograph in the other. It was the two of them standing by the lake, laughing. He hadn't laughed like that since. The phone on his desk rang. It was Daniel. "Russell, we've got a problem," he said. "Warren knows you're looking into him. He's moving fast. I think he's headed your way." Russell's grip tightened around the photo. "Then I'll be waiting." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering snow against the windows like whispers. Two lives, one broken by guilt, the other by fear, were now on a collision course neither could stop. And miles away, on a nearly empty bus, a woman who'd spent 3 years running was finally going home. The bus rolled into Sandpoint before dawn. The streets were empty, the snow on the sidewalks untouched, and the air sharp enough to sting when Adeline stepped off. She hadn't been back in 3 years. The town felt smaller than she remembered, quieter, but every corner whispered memories she had spent years trying to bury. The small bookstore where she used to wait for her father after school. The diner where they'd had their last lunch before everything fell apart. The lake where she used to paint while he worked on his laptop from the car. Everything looked the same. She was the one who had changed. Now she was Lena Caro, the woman who'd died once and didn't know how to live again. She rented a room at a roadside inn, one of those places where the carpets smelled of pine cleaner and cigarette smoke. She didn't plan to stay long. She just needed to see him, not to talk, not yet, but to see with her own eyes what kind of man he had become. That evening, as the town lights blinked on across the lake, she walked the familiar route to the Vance estate. The house stood at the top of the hill, its windows glowing faintly against the dusk. From a distance, it looked exactly as it always had, grand, quiet, and lonely. The gate was half open. She hesitated. The last time she walked through it, she was 21, furious, and certain she'd never come back. Now she slipped through like a thief. The yard was silent except for the soft crunch of snow beneath her boots. Through the large window in the living room, she could see him. Russell Vance sat in an armchair by the fireplace, an old photo album open on his lap. He looked older, not just in years, but in spirit. The firelight made the silver in his hair gleam, and his hands, once steady and commanding, now trembled as he turned each page. Adeline stood frozen, watching him from the dark. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind for years. She thought she'd feel anger, maybe relief. Instead, what came was something she couldn't name, grief for a man still alive, for a father she had loved and hated all at once. Inside, Russell turned another page and paused. It was a picture of her at 16, holding up her first art award. She remembered that day, how proud she'd been until he missed the ceremony. He'd sent flowers instead. He stared at the photo for a long time, his lips moving as though whispering an apology to the past. Then the sound of an engine outside broke the silence. A black SUV pulled up to the gate. The headlights cut across the yard, nearly blinding Adeline where she hid behind the oak tree. She ducked lower, heart pounding. The driver's door opened. Warren Kelder stepped out. Adeline's breath caught. The man she'd believed was her father's partner, her uncle, growing up, now looked sharper, colder, the kind of man who didn't show up without reason. Russell opened the front door before Warren could knock. "What are you doing here?" Russell's voice carried through the night, low and edged with fury. Warren smiled faintly, brushing snow off his coat. "You've been digging, Russ. Pulling files that should have stayed buried. I came to remind you that some ghosts are best left alone." "I know what you did," Russell said. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Warren's smirk didn't fade. "I didn't do anything you didn't sign off on. You think your little angel would have wanted the world to know how dirty your money was?" Russell's fist clenched. "You're lying." "Am I?" Warren stepped closer, his voice lowering. Maybe that's why she ran off that night. Maybe she found out what kind of man her father really was. Adeline pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Russell's voice shook now. "You don't talk about her." Warren tilted his head. "She's gone, Russ. Let it die with her." There was a click, sharp and unmistakable. Russell froze. Warren had drawn a gun. "Let it go," Warren said softly. "You've got more than enough to live out your days in comfort. Walk away." Russell didn't move. His eyes, wet with tears and rage, met Warren's. "You killed my daughter." And that's when Adeline stepped forward. Her voice tore through the cold like thunder. "Stop." Both men turned toward the sound. Russell's entire world stopped moving. For a moment he didn't breathe. His eyes locked on the shadow standing under the porch light, the shape of someone he'd buried 3 years ago. "Adeline," he whispered. She stepped closer, the hood of her coat falling back to reveal her face. The same eyes, the same trembling jaw, the same scar above her brow from when she fell off her bike as a kid. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. Russell stumbled backward, the color draining from his face. The gun in Warren's hand wavered, his expression collapsing from arrogance into pure disbelief. "I told you," Russell whispered, his voice breaking. "I told everyone she wasn't gone." Adeline's hands shook, tears mixing with snow on her cheeks. I'm sorry. I had to disappear. They were going to kill me. Who? Russell's voice cracked. Warren, she said, her gaze locking on the man beside him. He's the one who tried to. The sound of the gunshot split the air before she could finish. Russell lunged forward, grabbing her and pulling her behind him. The bullet tore through the side of the doorframe, splintering wood. Run, he shouted. Adeline stumbled, the shock freezing her for half a second before instinct took over. She turned and bolted toward the gate, snow crunching beneath her boots as Warren fired again. Russell tackled him, the two men crashing into the wall by the fireplace. The gun skidded across the floor, landing near Adeline's feet. She stared at it, trembling. She could end it right now. All of it. But before she could move, Russell yelled, "Go! Please!" For the first time since her death, she obeyed him. She ran into the night, leaving the sound of her father's struggle echoing behind her. Outside, snow continued to fall, painting the world in white silence. From the hilltop, flashes of light flickered through the windows of the house, shadows of a fight, a reckoning years in the making. Adeline stopped halfway down the road, gasping for air, her heart breaking as she looked back. The house that had once been her home was now burning with a light that didn't belong to the fire inside. She had finally come home, but she might have come too late. The night stretched endlessly over Sandpoint. The snowfall had turned from gentle flurries into a steady, suffocating storm. Adeline ran until the lights of the Vance estate disappeared behind her and the only sound left was her breath echoing in the dark. She collapsed near the frozen creek behind the old churchyard, her hands raw and shaking. For a long time, she couldn't move. Every inch of her body trembled, from the cold, the fear, the disbelief that it had finally happened. She'd seen her father again. He was alive. He had seen her. But that gunshot. She couldn't stop hearing it. Adeline wiped her eyes, forcing herself to stand. She had to go back. She had to know what happened. By the time she reached the hill again, the night sky had turned gray with dawn. Smoke rose faintly from the house. The front door hung half open, and the yard was littered with snowprints leading in every direction. Inside, the air was thick with gunpowder and burnt wood. The living room looked like a war zone. The fire was out, the curtains half torn, and blood streaked the floor near the hearth. Russell Vance was gone. Adeline's chest tightened. Her knees almost gave out, but she forced herself to look around. Near the doorway, she spotted something, her father's old watch, cracked, its face smeared with blood. She clutched it to her chest. He had fought for her. Even after everything, he had protected her one last time. She didn't know where Warren was. The police sirens were still distant. Someone must have called them, but she couldn't stay. Not yet. She had to go somewhere only she and her father had ever gone together. The cemetery. By noon, the snow had stopped. The sky hung pale and heavy, like it was holding its breath. The old churchyard was quiet except for the creak of bare branches swaying in the wind. Adeline walked between the headstones until she reached the one that bore her own name. Adeline Vance, beloved daughter, 1996 to 2022. She stared at it for a long time. The flowers at the base were fresh, their stems frozen stiff in the snow. Her father had been here recently, probably that same morning, before everything spiraled into violence. She knelt down, brushing snow from the stone. Her name looked strange carved in granite, like a cruel joke that life had played, burying a person who was still breathing. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad." Behind her, footsteps crunched softly in the snow. Her body went rigid. She turned slowly, half expecting the worst. It was him. Russell stood a few feet away, his coat unbuttoned, his face pale and streaked with dried blood along his temple. He looked like a man who had been through hell and hadn't quite returned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to still. No wind, no sound, just the weight of everything left unsaid. When Russell finally moved, it was slow, almost hesitant. His hand trembled as he reached out, as if afraid she might disappear again. But she didn't. She took his hand. And that was when he broke. The man who'd built empires, who'd stood unshaken before boardrooms and politicians, crumbled right there in the snow beside his daughter's grave. His sobs were raw, wordless, years of guilt and grief pouring out all at once. Adeline held him until the shaking stopped. When he could finally speak, his voice was small. "I thought I lost you forever." She nodded against his shoulder. "You almost did." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "Warren." Her face fell. "Gone. I think he ran before the police came." Russell exhaled slowly. "He won't get far. I made sure of it. Before you came back, I left evidence with someone I trust." Adeline blinked. "You knew he'd come?" "I suspected." He paused, his expression heavy. "The night you disappeared, I found a wire transfer from one of my accounts, a payment I never approved. It was made to someone who later vanished. I tried to trace it back, but every path led to Warren. He kept me quiet with lies, until I started digging again." Adeline lowered her head. "I didn't fake my death to hurt you, Dad. I didn't know who I could trust. They threatened me. I had to disappear until I could prove what they'd done." Russell's hand found hers again, firm this time. "You did what you had to. You're here now. That's all that matters." The words broke something inside her, the wall she'd built to keep the pain out. She cried again, but it wasn't the same kind of crying. It was release. The police arrived shortly after. Warren had been found a mile from the house, bleeding from a shoulder wound, trying to flee toward the county line. He was taken into custody without resistance. The case that followed tore through the headlines in Idaho for weeks. A story of corruption, betrayal, and the man who mourned a daughter who was still alive. But behind all the noise, Russell and Adeline withdrew from the world. They spent their days in the quiet town he once thought he'd leave behind. He gave up the company, not in scandal but in peace, and chose something simpler. He restored the old art studio that had once been hers, turning it into a community space for local kids to paint, learn, and find purpose. No headlines covered that part. No cameras followed them there. It was just a father and daughter, rebuilding piece by piece what time and lies had broken. One afternoon, months later, Adeline returned to the cemetery. The grave with her name still stood, untouched. Her father had never removed it. When she asked him why, he simply said, "It reminds me that miracles are possible, that sometimes the dead come back, not to haunt us, but to save us." She stood there quietly, her fingers brushing the cold stone. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't lost. She finally understood that love, real love, doesn't die, even when everything else does. It waits. Sometimes in pain. Sometimes in silence. But it waits. Behind her, Russell called from the path, his voice soft and warm. "Come on, Addie. The kids are waiting." She smiled, turning back toward him. The sky above the cemetery had cleared completely, revealing a stretch of bright blue that felt almost like forgiveness. As they walked away, a small wind stirred the snow around her old grave, lifting one of the wilted flowers and carrying it gently toward the horizon. The inscription on the stone caught the light one last time. Her name, the dates, and beneath them, words Russell had carved himself. Gone once, found forever. If this story made your heart pause for even a second, maybe it's because deep down, we've all lost someone, or feared to. Subscribe not for me, but for the stories that remind us what it means to feel.